This is a rough map of the world in the early 15th century. There was far more unknown and mystery surrounding the size and the shape of the world. There were still large pockets of civilizations, some of which still did not know of each other's existence. In the very west, around Mexico, you would have found civilizations like the Aztecs and the Tutupac. Around Peru and Bolivia of today, you would have found the Incas and the Aymara civilizations. While the Incas and the Aztecs certainly knew of each other and had established trade relations, no contact had been made with the civilizations across the oceans. To Europeans, the 15th century world still looked something like this. No notion of Americas, and a very vague understanding of the size and shape of the African continent. There were only guesses estimating the circumference of the world and the size of its oceans. Europe certainly was trading with other civilizations, but not to a huge extent. There was always massive demand for spices and other Asian luxuries, but these could barely reach Europe, seeing as how far they had to travel, and because Islamic countries heavily taxed the goods moving through their lands and restricted them based on religion. But either way, Europeans were not producing much of anything worth that they could sell, so they always had to exchange spices for gold or silver, which ultimately meant that Europe remained relatively poor. Moving further east, you would find the far more prosperous Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, like other Western Asian nations, were able to capitalize on their central location by having access to the Silk Road and by taxing the contents passing through their lands. But as far as maritime trade or exploration went, the Ottomans were contained by their geography. Straits stopped them in all directions, and access to the ocean was through narrow channels easily controlled by enemies. So if you wanted to find real prosperity in the 15th century and the part of the world that had most goods and wealth to trade, along with the biggest navies, you needed to go further east. The vast majority of trade being conducted in the world was happening between the civilizations situated around the Indian Ocean all the way to Japan and the Ryukyu kingdoms in the East China Sea. The East really was the center of the world at the time. And until the 1490s, any well-informed and objective observer would have acknowledged the powers around Asia or the Indian Ocean as homes to the planet's most dynamic and best equipped exploring cultures. Since most of the transforming initiatives that helped produce modernity came from China. Paper and printing were Chinese inventions, and so was gunpowder. Industrialization would have been impossible without the blast furnace and exploitation of coal for energy, all Chinese inventions. Modern capitalism would have been impossible without paper money, another idea coming from China. The conquest of the world's oceans depended on adaptations of Chinese direction finding and shipbuilding technologies. So in science, finance, commerce, communication, and war, it all depended on Chinese technologies and ideas. And so early in the 15th century, it would have seemed impossible that Europe could rival China or India in almost anything. Europe was kind of a dark place, low on money, low on resources, technologically backwards, and with the exception of Venetians and the Genoans, who had a monopoly on trade coming in from the east, Europe was isolated. And it was exactly this set of circumstances that ultimately set it on course to explore the unknowns. Europeans had to look outside of their borders to find new trade routes and resources, or forever remain backwards and far removed. Their sailors did, however, have one crucial advantage: the wind. An extraordinary fact of historic maritime exploration is that most of it had been done against the wind. This may seem counterintuitive, but it made perfect sense for most of the past, simply because explorers of the unknown needed to be sure of their route home. When sailing against the wind, the explorer could at least be sure that he was going to have an easy return journey. To break the mold and sail outwards with the wind was considered foolhardy, and this is exactly what Columbus took a chance doing. So what we today call the trade winds are the easterly winds that blow from east to west in what are known as the horse latitudes, around 30 degrees north and south of the equator. So not only was Europe hungry to find resources and trade routes to China, they also had an easier access to wind power that could propel their ships westwards at a far accelerated pace. Whereas Chinese vessels leaving at similar latitudes trying to cross the Pacific would have had to sail against the wind, making the long journey that much more difficult, not to mention the difference in the distance that needed to be crossed. And realistically, China and other Asian nations were not in any hurry to go out and explore because they had plenty of trade keeping them busy where they were. So it was Columbus who first made acquaintance of the winds and currents of the African Atlantic. He acquired enough experience of sailing to know two key facts. There were easterly winds in the latitudes of the Canaries and westerlies to its north. Columbus set out on his journey from the port of San Sebastián de la Gomera, which was the most westerly harbour at the disposal of the Spanish, and its latitude matched what most cartographers estimate to be that of Guangzhou, the most famed port in the Chinese world. And on September 6, 1492, they set their course due west. 36 days later, Columbus arrived in the Americas somewhere on the coast of Bahamas. He didn't yet know that he had discovered a new continent, and instead hopefully claimed that he had landed in Asia. With his claim, the world stepped into a new age of unprecedented biologic and economic change. Columbus had kickstarted the age of imperialism and opened the doors to Europe's rise to power and to a globalized world. Other explorers rushed to exploit the opening of trade winds, and as a consequence, the 1490s were a breakthrough decade in Europe's efforts to reach out across the ocean. In 1497, Captain Vasco da Gama, heading south through the Cape of Good Hope, rounding the southern tail of Africa and cruising along its heavily unknown eastern coast before reaching his destination in India. That same year, John Cabot, on a small British ship, sailed westward and landed in what we now know as Newfoundland. The voyage of Italian merchant Amerigo Vespucci, an explorer alongside the Ojeda along South American coast in 1499, gave Europeans a vivid understanding of the land across the ocean. It was only until Ferdinand Magellan's expedition from 1519 to 1521 that the Portuguese were able to pass through the Americas. This passage is now known as the Straits of Magellan and has opened doors to many European expeditions beyond the Americas. So as maritime technology continued to develop, together with the knowledge contributed by Columbus and his successors, Portugal, England, Holland and France set expedition after expedition to explore new trade routes. As this was happening, the economy of Europe began migrating to the Americas as well as other world regions, thereby gaining access to resources and prosperity it had never known. The world was not instantly transformed. The process was long, painful, and interrupted by many reversals. Yet, that process had begun more or less in 1492 with Columbus's journey, and the Atlantic Rim communities that had launched it, especially those of Spain and Portugal, retained their momentum and continued their dominance in exploration for most of the next 3 centuries. The opening of viable trade routes between Europe and productive regions of the Americas ensured that the global balance of resources would change in favor of European nations, and the whole balance of the world's global distribution of power and wealth started to tilt westwards. You could say that the process of this shift took 347 years, since in 1839 Britain and China went to war in what were called the Opium Wars. In the end, China had to give up rights to Hong Kong and its surrounding islands, as well as pay Britain a considerable amount of money. Asian cultures had been eclipsed technologically and economically, and ultimately it was because of the disadvantages that Europe was facing in the 15th century that forced them to go out there and more or less conquer the world.
I love this part of history because few realize that not too long ago, Europeans were the smelly backwoods savages of history. We were essentially the Rocky Balboa, the people who came from nowhere and who surprised everyone at the end. Most of the knowledge I've shared in this video, I've gained from listening to great courses on Audible and from reading 1492, the year the world began. So if you like this video, help me keep going. Subscribe, ring the bell button, and leave a comment. Guess where this is, and I'll see you in the next video. GeoPerspective out.